And recording in progress. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and we are going to work to briskly get you answers in the time we have. Please put your news organization, and if you don't mind, let us know if you are going to the Beijing Olympics in person in China. A short introduction. For the last 30 years, Human Rights Watch has reported on deepening repression in China, including before, during, and after the 2008 Beijing Olympic Summer Games. On February 4, in just over 2 weeks, the Beijing Winter Olympics will launch in China. Against a backdrop of Chinese government crimes against humanity, targeting Uyghur Muslims, repression in Hong Kong and Tibet, and risks to athletes unprecedented in the modern Olympic era. Designed to sports wash China's abysmal human rights record, these Winter Games reflect leader Xi Jinping's efforts to burnish China's image on the world stage and distract attention from the Chinese government's assault on civil society, journalists, health rights activists, and peaceful critics. For China under Chinese Communist Party rule, the Winter Olympics are a geopolitical event intended to cover up and validate the government's repressive policies. They are political. Throughout history, among the most powerful advocates and voices for change have been athletes, from John Carlos and Tommie Smith, who organized the Olympic Project for Human Rights at the 1968 Olympics, to modern day Olympians and professional athletes who advocate for human rights, including to equal pay and advocate against abuse and harassment in sport. However, in China, athletes will be surveilled and their rights to free speech and protest curtailed. Even one of the best known Chinese athletes and Olympians, tennis player Peng Shuai, was silenced after she made a sexual assault complaint against a former government and Olympics official on Chinese social media. To discuss athletes' rights and risks in China, we welcome today an amazing panel of experts. Noah Hoffman is a Nordic ski athlete and participated in the last 2 Winter Olympics. Yaqiu Wang is Human Rights Watch's China researcher. Craig Foster is a former Australian professional athlete and human rights activist, joining us from Australia, where it is after midnight. Thank you, Craig. Rob Kohler is the Director General of Global Athlete, an athlete-led advocacy group with hundreds of Olympians as members. Maximilian Klein is a sport policy representative from Athleten Deutschland, which is Germany's independent athletes association. And Sophie Richardson is Human Rights Watch's China director. We also are joined for any German language media by Wenzel Michalski, the director of Human Rights Watch in Germany, and my colleague Wolfgang Buttner, who's also with us today. I will begin with the first question to Sophie Richardson, which goes to the human rights situation in China now. Sophie, in 2009, the then International Ski Federation president, Gianfranco Casper, gave an interview where he claimed the Olympics are easier in dictatorships. He said, dictators can organize events such as this without asking the people's permission. Can you give us an overview of the human rights situation in China and give us your opinion about whether the Olympics are easier in dictatorships, and perhaps also, are they better in dictatorships?
Minky, thanks, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. To that comment, I just have to say, I would love to hear Thomas Bach and the International Olympic Committee reconcile that perspective with their claim that the games are always, quote, a force for good. Minky, let me try to highlight a few quick points that I think are indicative of the human rights abuses inside China now that have salience to these games. At the top of that list has to be Xi Jinping's government having committed and continuing to commit crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic communities. These are atrocity crimes. They are among the most serious under international law, and they should give everyone pause about engaging in any sort of activity that lends any political credibility to this government. I think people also need to be aware that freedom of expression inside China is absolutely on the ropes. Any journalists who are going to cover these games should be aware not only of the threats and the challenges they will face in trying to cover whatever critical stories the authorities don't want them to cover, but indeed the difficulty that ordinary citizens have simply sharing views that may be perceived as critical to one another on social media are increasingly criminalized. Next on the list, there is nothing resembling the rule of law inside China. The party uses the legal system as an instrument to maintain its political power. Maybe the best way to make this more comprehensible to people is to know that only a tiny minority of criminal defendants, for example, have any sort of legal defense at all, and the conviction rate remains 99%. It is explicitly stipulated that the legal system serves the party's interests. One of Xi Jinping's clear goals over the last several years has been to prosecute, persecute, detain, disappear, and/or drive into exile independent civil society activists. So where in 2008 there was maybe a little bit of room for Chinese citizens to protest around the games, many of the kinds of people who engaged in that behavior or might be considering doing it this time around have already been prosecuted on baseless charges. And then last but not least, one of the features of the 2008 games was the authorities' use of what was then considered high technology. That pales in comparison to the Orwellian surveillance state the authorities use across the country now, where tools like AI and predictive policing, big data, databases, and extensive surveillance of social media platforms keeps people from engaging in certain kinds of conversations. And I think anyone who's traveling to the country for these games, journalists, athletes, coaches, needs to be aware that this kind of surveillance could actually affect them too. So Minky, hopefully that's a good snapshot of some of the egregious violations that we're documenting today.
So Orwellian surveillance and major risks to journalists, athletes, coaches, and others. Noah, let me go to you with a question. You competed in the last two Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia, and Pyeongchang, South Korea. When you've heard what Sophie Richardson has had to say about the human rights climate in China, what is your perspective as a Winter Olympian, as an athlete? I know you can't speak for the thousands of athletes who are going to China very shortly or are already there to compete, but what's your perspective as an athlete about this setting of crimes against humanity, Orwellian surveillance, and dangerous risks?
Yeah, thanks, Minky. I have two main reactions, and one is anger that athletes are being put in this position. Athletes have absolutely no choice in where the Olympics are held and in whether or not to attend the games. It's a false choice to say that athletes could choose not to attend. Our careers depend on this. I was introduced today as a two-time Olympian. That happens all the time. The two Olympics I attended define my career. It's not the World Cup wins that I had. It's not the national championships that I won. It's not the 10 years I spent as a member of the US ski team. It's the two Olympics that I went to in 2014 and 2018. That's true of every athlete. And it is, you can't have an Olympic cross-country ski career or many other sports that are not high profile. You can't have an international level cross-country ski career without attending the Olympics. You can't choose not to attend and continue your career. Your sponsorships depend on it. Your ranking in the world depends on it. Your ability to continue to be supported by the national team depends on it. All of those things depend on it. So I'm angry that we're having this press conference, that we're having this press conference, that we have to have this press conference. Because we should be talking about teammates who have been skiing in the top 5 in the world, that are coming in looking for the first individual medal for a woman from the US in the history of US cross-country skiing. It would be an amazing accomplishment, and yet here I am, instead of promoting them and their successes, I'm talking about human rights. That makes me upset. The second thing that I feel is fear for my teammates who are going to China. As Sophie was talking about, the lack of digital privacy, the lack of ability to speak freely, I know that my teammates are being shielded from questions about these issues ahead of the games, out of their own safety, for their own safety, but that they're not only have we seen that the IOC is refusing to let them speak openly while at the games and refusing to defend athletes who speak out, but the sport organizations in this country and their teams, out of the welfare, looking towards the welfare of the athletes, are protecting them from human rights issues. We should never be protecting athletes, never be having to protect athletes from speaking out about issues that they think are really important. Athletes have an amazing platform, an amazing ability to speak out, to be leaders in society, to be role models, and yet here we are not letting them shield questions about certain issues ahead of these games. That makes me upset, and I'm scared for their safety when they go to China.
Thanks, Noah. And as we go along, if I find questions in the chat that are directly relevant for current speakers, I'm gonna kick them in. And so Kim from USA Today has a follow-up question for you, Noah, and that is, what do you see as the response, given this context of danger and risk and massive surveillance, what do you see as the responsibility of athletes to try to raise these issues while in China? And bearing in mind the ban on any type of podium demonstration or participation in any type of political statement while participating. That's back to you, Noah.
Yeah, got you. Not only have we seen that the Chinese authority threatening the freedom of expression and threatening people in China who speak out, we've also seen the International Olympic Committee say that, leave in place Rule 50.2 that prohibits podium protest, that prohibits speaking out on the field of play, simple gestures such as raising a fist or taking a knee. So my advice to athletes that are there, and my hope for athletes that are there, is that they stay silent, because they are not only going to be prosecuted by the Chinese authorities potentially, or disappeared as we've seen Peng Shuai be, but they're also going to be punished by the IOC. There's no guarantee that they're going to have support, that their message is even going to be received because of the firewall in China and the safeguards that are put in place against people speaking out. So I think that athletes have a responsibility to keep themselves safe, and that is their only responsibility. They can speak out when they get back, but they do not have a responsibility to deal with this issue that the IOC has put them in, because it would threaten their own safety, and that's not a reasonable ask of athletes, to put their safety at risk.
Yeah, and we'll talk about ways that athletes can express their concerns about human rights. I'm going to go now to Yaqiu Wang. Yaqiu, you were in China for the 2008 Summer Olympics. What is your, and you've also closely followed the Peng Shuai case. Can you speak for a minute? I think we want to make sure that voices of Chinese athletes are included. Would you mind to share your perspective of how things have changed in China from the 2008 Olympics to now? And then also, why haven't we heard anything from Chinese athletes since the conditions in China are so dire? Surely they too would want to speak up.
Hi everyone. I was in China as a an audience for the games in 2008. I think, Sophie mentioned a lot of the human rights violations getting worse since 2008, like surveillance, censorship, crackdown on civil society. I mean, as a Chinese citizen at the time, I felt, the country took huge pride in this game. People were happy, and there were a lot of willingness to learn from the West. People were using this opportunity to communicate with people who come to China, people who are watching the game. But I think this has changed so much in a sense. Now there is a very much nationalistic feeling. There's much antagonizing feeling towards the West. This might be another reason athletes or anybody or journalists who go into China needs to be careful about. People are much less receptive to communication with outsiders. In terms of question about, we don't hear from Chinese athletes, that's a very unfortunate thing, because, they are so much controlled by the Chinese government in terms of communication, right? No, you don't. I don't think any Western media outlets have been successfully interviewed any of these athletes who will participate in the Beijing Games, very much because probably the government tell them not to do that. I think this is obviously getting worse. I mean, I remember during the Summer Olympics, athletes were on Chinese social media talking about issues they care about. This is much less the case because of the censorship, because of the control on them. I would mention, the Peng Shuai case. The government made Peng Shuai to appear on various videos to show I'm very, I'm doing well, don't worry about me. The last video where she was attending some event, and Yao Ming, probably China's most famous basketball star, also appeared with her. Whether this is a setup, we don't know, right? But you can see how, the government is having the athletes to participate in some kind of, propaganda for certain political purposes. So we will see, whether, any Chinese athletes would say something that the government would think be critical, but I doubt that will happen.
Thanks very much. Craig, for an autocracy like China, the Olympics are a geopolitical event. I think it's actually true of any host of the Olympics in the world. But as a lifelong athlete and a human rights activist, how do you think athletes should see, and the world should see, the Beijing Olympics? And I'm going to add in here Martin Ziegler's question from the Times of what would Human Rights Watch want to see from Olympic athletes who are going to Beijing in terms of raising human rights issues. And I would add here that Craig is a lifelong professional athlete, the former captain of the men's national team in Australia, who has spoken out particularly on refugee rights and human rights and athletes' rights to speak. Craig, to you.
Thanks, Minky, and hello to all my fellow panelists and everyone on the call. Okay, so a number of points to make as quickly as I can there. Firstly, I think these Olympics, we can agree, are one of the most egregious when it comes to human rights abuse in history of sport. And I might say that the human rights abuse also that are going later this year in the 2022 FIFA World Cup make this year of 2022, I hope, something of a watershed moment whereby there is a reckoning for global sport, particularly IOC and, of course, including FIFA, which has already granted also to China, whilst it's delayed, the Club World Cup without a human rights audit. So global sport is right in this, in the heart and center across all of the major sports right at the moment. Perhaps 1934 Mussolini FIFA World Cup, 1936 Berlin Nazi Olympics, and thirdly, I would add 1978 FIFA World Cup, Argentinian military junta, and the national reorganization process where literally thousands of people were being murdered left-wing people in Argentina at that time, and yet the FIFA World Cup still went ahead on the basis that global sport has for so long tried to propagate, and that is that it has absolutely nothing to do, has no responsibility to the broader societies in which it presents itself, in which it carries its sponsors, in which it now puts its athletes at risk. So I agree with what Noah said before, that many of the questions on here about what should the athletes do, the most important question above anything else here is what should Thomas Bach do and what should the IOC do? And why have they put athletes in this situation of risk? Why have they put all of what they call or purport to call these principles of Olympism, non-discrimination, that clearly doesn't correspond to the Uyghurs and the crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated against them, which is one of the most egregious forms of discrimination, religious discrimination that we currently see on the planet. And humanism and solidarity and all of these things, all of these slogans that the IOC loves to propagate. Brave athletes want to speak out. Brave and all athletes have a right. Many athletes feel they have a responsibility and they have every right to be speaking out whenever it is that they're competing. Why? Is because the world faces so many global challenges right now that no industry is immune. No one on the planet is immune to having to do our part, each of us, to support these issues, whether it is religious censure and erasure of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or whether it is climate action. So sport is not immune. Sport does not exist external to society. Sport is a global industry that should be bound to the UNGPs. And like FIFA, who are still having some serious challenges and having to be forced to uphold the human rights policy, it's time that the Olympics had one. The athletes are going there under severe risk. And the question is why the IOC have placed them in it. Why it's prepared to provide what should be a celebration of humanity at a time when a level of inhumanity is being perpetrated on the Uyghur people, which puts the entire cause, the entire motive, the entire nature of the Olympics in Beijing under serious question. And finally, as to what the question for Thomas Bach right now is, what are you going to do? What is the Olympics going to do if and when an Olympian speaks out, whether on the Uyghurs or on, for instance, refugee rights? And of course, many of my friends who are Uyghurs here in Australia are refugees who have fled persecution. And if they speak out on these issues, what is Thomas Bach going to do? You created this situation. Athletes have always felt compelled to speak out on broader social issues, and rightly so. They have a platform, they have a responsibility to the communities from which they come, and they rightly feel impassioned about very many really important human rights issues around the world, and they may speak up, and that is your responsibility. So that's a very serious matter for any athletes right now who are contemplating doing so. It is very much the responsibility of the IOC to have already made public statements on this. It is your tournament. It is your rights that you have granted to China, and you have the responsibility over the athletes under your care during the administration of your tournament. What are you going to say to the CCP today about athletes who are going to turn up there and rightly speak about any of the human rights issues they feel strongly about around the world? That's what I'd like to know.
Thanks, Craig. I'm going to go now to Maximilian Klein, and I wanted to, Craig has referenced the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and this is the global standard. It is the system that is adopted by the most of the sponsors, all except for Alibaba, the top sponsors of the Beijing Olympics. And I wanted to talk to you for a minute about German athletes and their perspective, but also the systems. The IOC has conducted a human rights stakeholder consultation. It is pledged to adopt at some point the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but it has postponed this until after the Beijing Olympics, which creates the risks that we are, which contributes to the risks that we're discussing now. I wanted to ask you about systems that German athletes are working to set up to protect them, including their right to be free of verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. What risks are German athletes concerned about now?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Yeah, maybe I'll split my answer into two parts, speaking from the German perspectives and how we're working to improve the human rights of athletes in Germany, but also looking at the risks athletes are facing with regards to the upcoming Winter Olympics, which we already touched on. From Germany, you know, from a German perspective, and that this is a worldwide debate, elite athletes, but also athletes in sport for all, are facing structural risks of interpersonal violence and abuse. And we know that sport systems, sport organizations cannot sort of, you know, regulate themselves. They cannot fight or conduct a fight against abuse on their own. And this is why we've been fighting for you know, a dispersion of power by setting up an independent oversight mechanism, an independent center for safe sport. And we're really happy that our new German government included our proposals for a center for safe sport in the coalition agreement of the new government. And politics, there was like cross-party support by politics and by civil society organizations and survivors and athletes, where we really hope that this can be a role model as we see the discussions in other countries like the US, Canada, or Australia, that sport needs to be regulated, and that we need a true separation of powers where you know, there is an entity that can do investigations, that can actually penalize a safe haven for athletes, where they can make disclosures and all these kinds of discussions. And we're really happy that we're making progress in Germany, because this is what we're aiming for here, also by independently representing elite athletes, giving them a voice, but also fighting for system level change, not like tiny steps. We really want to tackle the system level and structural problems. I'm speaking from the human rights risks athletes face. They are now going to China, and we know that they, you know, some of them, and athletes are a heterogeneous group, and some of them are really focusing on their sporting competitions, and this is what they are supposed to, and this is their right to do so. This is very important. So as Noah already said, it's right that they shouldn't be the ones dealing with that. But if they want to, and we see a high sensitivity in the athlete body towards the towards the human rights records in China, they should be protected by, when using their platforms. So athletes are an inspirational power, and they should have the right and their freedom of speech to highlight all these human rights breaches and to use their platform. But that's the big problem. Their freedom of speech is limited, very much limited by the Rule 50. So this is a human rights risk they are facing. We are afraid or we are concerned how the IOC is going to ensure their physical integrity should they decide to use their platform and be critical. How is the IOC going to ensure that they are safe? And we've seen with the Peng Shuai case that the IOC is neither willing or capable of protecting athletes, and the IOC and the Olympic movement have a very sad track record when it comes to protecting athletes' rights. I think that's the key point here, that the IOC has the responsibility to or also credibly ensure that they put their human rights due diligence and athletes' rights first, and not economic and political considerations. And so far, we can't see any actions where the IOC is credibly restoring this lost faith. We're not only talking about freedom of speech and physical integrity. We are also talking about the risks of espionage, cybersecurity, and data privacy breaches. So there are a number of risks athletes are facing, journalists are facing, a number of human rights risks associated with the Olympic Games. And we don't see that the IOC is disclosing human rights assessment and not seeing any strategy to mitigate these risks. Neither are we seeing the debate with the broader debate that we should have a debate on, red lines. Where do we draw the lines when it comes to awarding the games? Everyone now is talking and debating this, and maybe we should have a debate on this, whether the Olympic Games should be awarded to a country with crimes against humanity. This is maybe a qualitative difference to other countries. And it's up to the sports movement to discuss this, because otherwise we believe that the values of sports are really damaged for a long time if sport doesn't conduct this debate in the future, because athletes don't want to be put in this situation again, having to bear the responsibility for decisions and mistakes that were made years ago without involving the athletes in the decision-making processes.
Thanks very much. I'm going to quickly answer a question from Nazi Karim from the South China Morning Post. And their question is, why just China? Aren't there many countries engaged in human rights abuses? And I just want to direct everyone to the recently published Human Rights Watch World Report. We've published this, I think it's more than 800-page report on global human rights, on the situation country by country for more than 100 countries, including the US, UK, France, and other countries that have hosted the Olympics in the past or will host the Olympics in the future. And very quickly, I just want to say every country commits human rights abuses. Corporations commit human rights abuses. The question is, do you have a framework to address and mitigate those abuses, as Maximilian Klein has just said? But certainly it is the case that there has not been in modern Olympic history a host government committing crimes against humanity. This is really a new low. It's not normal. It's not business as usual. So Rob Kohler, I wanted to go to you and to ask, Global Athlete represents hundreds of current and former Olympians. You have published a statement of grave concern last week about the risks to athletes of sports federations that partner with autocracies where athletes have no protection. Could you give us your perspective? And I'm also going to ask you to address the question by Margaret McQuaig Johnson, but she also reports that Citizen Lab says today that the app that Olympic athletes and team officials must download, right, not an option, reports politically sensitive content. So what should athletes, officials, and others do about this pernicious app? So first question, please give us Global Athletes' perspective, and I will also be putting your recent statement into the chat.
Thanks, Mickey. We've been very vocal for the past year and a half, 2 years on general human rights issues and athlete rights. And now it's coming obviously to the forefront when the IOC has awarded the games to China. Look, the IOC has an archaic, outdated system when it comes to awarding games and to athlete rights. And what we've seen is the IOC wants to play the long game. And I guarantee you the IOC is waiting, can't wait to the end of these games to move on and go as business as usual. And the sad part that we've seen is the IOC in sport doesn't want to change. All of the change that we're seeing, while it's slow, is forced change. It's forced change by athletes. And we look at independent athlete groups such as World Players, Athletes Germany, Athletes Can, Global Athlete, who is standing up and representing athletes. We are forcing change, and it's been a lonely place for athletes to push the IOC. And on top of that, now we have partners, and I first introduced to Minky when we saw the execution, the death of Navid Afkari. where the IOC refused to do anything when an Iranian athlete was peacefully protesting. And this is our concern. So when it comes to athletes, the IOC has a record, and the record for protection and to supporting is not great. And I'm going to give you examples of that. I just did of Navid Afkari, who was executed. Athletes spoke up to try to demand the IOC take action against Iran. We've seen what's happened in Belarus, where athletes have been jailed, have been tortured, have been removed from jobs, have been removed from Olympic teams because they're speaking up against an illegitimate president, Lukashenko. The IOC had a ceremonial suspension on the Belarus National Olympic Committee, but Belarus is still going to the games. Just in Tokyo, an athlete from Belarus was kidnapped, trying to bring her back to Belarus because she spoke up against the sporting system. Thankfully, she was brought to Poland and she is now safe. IOC has done nothing to push for change and to make these authoritative regimes accountable. The Iranian athletes have sent over 30 cases of athlete abuse, athlete detainment, athletes unable to compete because of their religious beliefs, women who have been removed from competition because not wearing a hijab. All these issues are human rights issues, and the IOC turns a blind eye. Now we're going to China, and I won't repeat what Noah and Max and Craig and Sophie has said, but major concerns that the IOC has proven they are not athlete-centered, they're not going to stand up for athletes, and we should be concerned. When it comes to surveillance, we know it's there. There's reasons that the Dutch and the Canadians and the Americans and the Germans have come out indicating to athletes not to bring their own mobile devices. Any person of a sane mind hears all of these things, must have concerns. And as I said, athletes are thrilled that we have human rights experts that are supporting them and demanding change. And I think we need one other actor to come forward, and that's sponsors. Sponsors fuel this business, a multi-billion-dollar industry, and for them to turn a blind eye, their fueling these is again needs to change. Sponsors need to step up. Athletes need more protection, and that's why we continue to push for a 50-50 partnership in sport, and I think we grow it instead of forcing it. And until we start growing it together, it's going to be forced change, and it's going to kill the Olympic brand. And I encourage everyone to continue to grow it, but we can't let off the gas pedal, and we need to continue to demand change. And that is ultimately making sure that the IOC embeds the UN Declaration of Human Rights into the Charter and brings athletes right to collectively bargain and be a part of the decisions to avoid this forever, ever happening again.
Thanks very much, Rob. We're opening to questions. Some of the questions and links we are putting in the chat just as background. I've recently, Sophie Richardson is sending background on our work in the past about the Sochi Olympics, the last Beijing Olympics, and other sports events. I did want to also add for the question from the South China Morning Post, in case there's some implication that Human Rights Watch is unfairly targeting China, that the first report that Human Rights Watch did on the Olympics and the terrible context for sporting events was around the around the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. We did a book-length report on prison conditions in the US state of Georgia. So China's not getting any special attention here, but it certainly is the case that there is a backdrop of unprecedented repression. I want to go to Tom Goldman's question from NPR, going to the games. Reaction to the public comment, I think this is for Sophie Richardson, the public comment that nobody cares about Uyghur genocide in China. This is an investor, Chamath Palihapitiya's comment that nobody cares about Uyghur genocide in China. And is there any truth to this for the IOC, for investors, for sponsors? And does it embolden the Chinese government in any way to hear that no one cares about Uyghur genocide? Sophie?
Well, what a weekend it was with that comment. So let's bracket the grotesque disdain displayed through those comments and look at this core issue about whether hosting the 2022 Winter Games helps the Chinese government escape accountability for crimes against humanity. I think that's sort of the core of the question here. It's certainly part of Beijing's goal in hosting the games to downplay and minimize and discourage any and all scrutiny, let alone any kind of accountability for atrocity crimes. But fortunately, that decision is not in the IOC's hands. So first of all, we've seen a number of governments, the US, the UK, Canada, and some others, announced that they're going to engage in a diplomatic boycott of the games specifically because of the Chinese government's human rights record. And that is one constructive step, we think, in denying Beijing the kind of political legitimacy it seeks around those games. But I think it's important to bear in mind that typically investigations in the pursuit of accountability for atrocity crimes lies with governments and with international institutions like the United Nations. And in that sense, I would want to draw your attention to the dozens of governments that have joined statements at the UN Human Rights Council and at the General Assembly in New York, condemning the Chinese government's policies towards Uyghurs. One of the most important things that needs to happen next is for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to finally publish a long-awaited assessment of the human rights environment in Xinjiang. It's not clear why that's taking as long as it is, given that her office had suggested it would be published before the end of the year. But perhaps to come full circle and back to NPR's question, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has now publicly said that he will go to the opening of the games. And not only is it imperative that the High Commissioner publish her report ahead of his arrival in Beijing, I would call your attention to the fact that Ban Ki-moon, the previous Secretary General, who is not always the strongest on human rights, managed to express concerns about human rights in Russia ahead of the Sochi Games. And we expect the Secretary General, the current Secretary General, to do no less. These are the important building blocks for actually holding the Chinese government accountable. No state is above the law. And we live in a time when, in fact, we're actually watching the Chinese government itself support commissions of inquiry into war crimes and crimes against humanity in other countries. So what's good for the goose should be good for the gander.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to come now to, we've got a bucket of questions that really are for our athletes and our athlete rights expert. And one of the questions from inside the game is, would the IOC guaranteeing freedom of speech off field for all athletes, delegations, journalists be of any significance to ensure questions can be asked and expressions made without fear? I'm going to go to, and I'm also going to bundle that together with Henry Bushnell's question from Yahoo Sports about whether our athlete rights experts know of any athletes who have been explicitly warned against speaking up about China's human rights abuses. And I'm going to start for that batch of questions with Noah, and then go to Craig. Noah, are you aware of any athletes who've been expressly warned against speaking out? And how do you feel about off-field expressions? Is that even possible with the Chinese Communist Party so closely monitoring and surveilling athletes, including before the games?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not aware of any athletes that have been, well, my understanding is that all US athletes have been warned about the security risks in China with regards to their own personal mobile devices. And I know for a fact that my teammates who are still competing are not, journalist questions about these issues are being deflected before they ever reach the athlete. am under the assumption now that this was happening during my career, but I was not aware of it. I had no idea that people wanted to hear from us about human rights issues. In a lot of ways, I was blogging daily during my career, and I was bringing up some of these issues, and I kind of felt like I was speaking into the void because I was never hearing anything back. And now I understand that actually the US ski team and the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee were trying to protect me by actually putting a blockade between me and the media who were trying to ask these questions. I think that that's very paternalistic of athletes. It makes me angry that I could have actually used my platform as an athlete ahead of Sochi, for instance, to speak up about human rights issues, and yet was never given the opportunity to speak with journalists. So I don't know of athletes that have been warned, but I do know of athletes that are being protected from questions about human rights. And I think that that's also a problematic way to approach this. Again, athletes are human beings first. As Craig talked about, there are lots of athletes who really want to engage with these issues, who feel like they have a duty to use their platforms to speak up about these issues. And yet the sport organizations who are connected to and part of the same system that awarded the games to China in the first place, that put athletes in this position, here they are putting a barrier between athletes and the media who want to talk to them about human rights issues. With regards to the IOC and whether guaranteeing protection for athletes who speak out off the field of play, certainly that would be a good first step. I would love to see guaranteed protections of any athletes who speak out about the Uyghurs on social media while in China. But it's certainly not the last step. There should be blanket protection for any athletes that speak up at any time about issues of human rights. This is not, you can't, athletes don't only enjoy human rights when they're not competing. Athletes don't only enjoy human rights when they're not on the podium. They enjoy human rights at all times. And so, yes, athletes should be protected when they're not on the podium and not on the field of play, but they should be protected when they're in those places as well. That's when the spotlight's on them. That's why the Mexico City protests have stuck in the collective memory for 60 years. That's why athletes continue to use the podium, even though the IOC promises to punish them for doing so. It's because that's when people are paying attention. That's when they can get the message across, and they understand that these issues are bigger than sport and bigger than them.
Thanks, very well put. Christoph Becker from the FODZ, who's also going to China, has a similar question, but also asked specifically about Rule 50. I'm going to go first to Craig on Rule 50 and then to Rob for the athlete's perspective. And please also answer, do you think the protections for athletes for free speech are adequate?
So the athletes should be in a position, and this year, as I said at the start, is a year I think where athlete rights, athlete power, athlete voice, athlete collectivism, as you heard earlier from Rob and others, is strengthening, because I think athletes have to take more responsibility and have far more involvement in future in the awarding of tournaments and in the administration of their sport. And that can only come through collective bargaining and through the collectivism. I think Olympic athletes, this is a year where they have to come to terms with that. When Peng Shuai, for instance, was, when the IOC and Thomas Bach did the now infamous video call with Peng Shuai, with Chinese officials, refused to speak out about the individual in question who had some involvement with the IOC, so clearly they were complicit. That was a moment when all of us around the world, not just athletes, but everyone else, understood very clearly the complicity of the IOC with the countries and the regimes and the ideologies with which they work. The question here around the awarding of tournaments goes to this concept of human rights and this safe zone that the IOC and FIFA should enforce and athletes should be able to rely on. One of those rights is the freedom of speech to speak up on other political or human rights issues. It doesn't matter if they're on the field off the field, on the podium, or anywhere else. The IOC could do that, such is the power of sport. And so at least during that window, in my view, global sport and our greatest sporting properties, our greatest sporting so-called, I say in inverted commas, celebrations, should also be a celebration of humanity, which means a celebration of human rights. They are one and the same. And therefore, the IOC and FIFA has the power, with the support of the players, to be able to say to any country in the world, our tournament, our event is coming on these terms. The proposition that global sport says that it is humanistic, that it is about non-discrimination, that is about gender equality, that is about these things, and yet it awards the hosting of its events and then allows the hosting country to coordinate and control the level of coercion, the level of social surveillance, the level of gender rights, the level of freedom of speech, which includes making so-called safe zones. We understand that that wasn't safe in 2008, and it's not going to be safe now in China, is a ridiculous proposition. Sport has to turn that on its head and say, if you are now going to host the FIFA World Cup or the IOC, you must correspond to these rights. At the very heart of that, of course, is athlete safety. And that means the ability to speak out on issues that they feel a responsibility to do so. I hope that this is the year that that happens. And I'll say again, when the Peng Shuai issue happened, I would have liked to hear from many, many more current and former Olympic athletes around the world. That's the moment when they have to speak up for each other. And I think, you know, the Olympic movement of athletes, it's time now to prosecute and interrogate these athlete commissions, the formulation of them, the complicity of them with the IOC movement themselves, and for Olympic athletes like professional athletes around the world who have now bargained their own rights to speak out, including in the sporting arena, whether that's NBA or a FIFA or others. It's time for them to do so. So just finally, I strongly supported Australia's diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. But in so doing, I called on the Australian government and Olympic athletes to take responsibility to go to the IOC and say, you have to do this better next time. A diplomatic boycott is of no value if the IOC do this again in 4 years' time. That's not acceptable. So, and I only support it on that basis. So the Australian government needs to say to the AOC and up to the IOC, now we need a different system. Don't put the athletes in this position and don't put us in this situation. That's your responsibility. The only way to do that is through the prism of human rights, by enforcing that in their hosting agreement and living up to it. And I would say again, by Olympic athletes like professional athletes around the world, collectivizing and becoming truly independent. Use your power, you have it. It is your tournament. It's not Thomas Bach's tournament. It is for the people of the world, and you are the athletes, and you need to claim that power.
Okay. Thanks, Craig. I want to come quickly to Rob. We're going to go a little over time to make sure we cover all of these important questions. So keep them coming. Rob, I'd like you to also help answer Graham Dunbar from the AP's question to clarify, will an incident of athlete protest just be a Rule 50 issue for the IOCs, or will it be subject to Chinese law? I'm actually going to go first to you about Rule 50, and then I'm actually going to come back to Sophie Richardson and Yacho Wong for a question also in the chat about how the rules apply, including to Chinese activists. Rob, to you on Rule 50.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we came out with a statement last week or earlier this week, advising athletes not to speak up, which is absolutely ridiculous that we're telling athletes to be quiet and to leave and to get home. And the reason being is Rule 50, if you go through the rule, it says under the applicable laws of the country. Well, we know the human rights record and the allowance of freedom of expression in China. So there's really not much protection that we believe that's going to be afforded to athletes. And the IOC has not come out proactively to indicate that we will protect and make sure everyone is safe that decides to speak up. Silence is complicity, and that's why we have concerns. So we're advising athletes not to speak up. And as Noah has said earlier, athletes shouldn't be put in this position and shouldn't have to get forced to do it. So we're concerned, and that's why we want them to compete, go home, and use their voice when they get home. And that's a sad statement that we have to say that.
Yeah, quite unprecedented in the modern Olympic era that athletes have to decide, have to weigh their personal safety and security while also having to compete at the highest level. It's really a tragedy. I want to make sure that we all, and Yacho, I would like to come to you for a question from Ken Hamaguchi from Kyoto News. Ken, thank you for joining us. A question about the recent situation of dissidents in China. And Ken points out that Chinese authorities have traditionally detained, put into black jails, or ordered them to make a trip outside somewhere before the games. Yacho, what information does Human Rights Watch have about the situation for peaceful critics in China, the civil society that was so vibrant in the run-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics?
Right now, because of COVID, the restrictions of movement is already very curtailed. But of course, the government is closely monitoring critics to see, whether they would speak up either on social media or, actually go out to do something on the street, something like that. I mean, this has been going on for years at any kind of big events, anniversaries. The government would pay special attention to those people. Those are the well-known, dissidents, activists who have track record of criticizing the government. Then there are also the people who are just regular citizens. They feel upset with the government's, stringent control over the COVID situation. I don't think, the country should waste all this money on this Winter Olympics. Those citizens are being constantly, detained, harassed. Just last week, the Radio Free Asia reported cases where, a person who said something about COVID testing athletes. I think a Spanish athlete was tested positive, something like that. The information was not verified, but this person was being, thrown into detention center just because he posted one message about athletes and the COVID testing. So those are just what we know. What we know is because either the Chinese government has disclosed, or people get so upset they have to speak up, despite the danger. So there are many cases we don't know, like how governments are harassing or detaining people for their critical speech. So I think, for anybody who lives in China knows that if you criticize the government, you will, be in a dangerous position. So I would say the vast majority would not even choose to do that in the first place.
But they would be prevented from that choice by being removed from the opportunity. I wanted to circle back to Sophie Richardson with a question and also a comment about the role of corporate sponsors. Rob mentioned that they're literally paying for these games and underwriting. We've seen many developments on the front of corporate social responsibility and responsibilities in China, including the passage in the United States in Congress, the House and the Senate in December of the End Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and signed into law by US President Joe Biden. There are other efforts afoot in Europe and other countries to end Uyghur forced labor and to make supply chains transparent. I wanted to ask Sophie Richardson, the IOC has an arrangement with the uniform supplier ANTA that sources labor and materials in Xinjiang proudly. How would this affect the Olympics? How would it affect athletes and other officials who might be wearing uniforms that are made with forced labor? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, at the risk of using the phrase grotesque indifference for the second time in the last half hour, it does seem to be a theme throughout this discussion for the IOC to, proudly wear clothes that have been made, that are credibly alleged to have been made with forced labor is pretty appalling. If there's good news, it's that will soon be, in some places, illegal, right? The underlying idea of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act is a sense that companies can't be trusted to do adequate human rights due diligence throughout their own supply chains. And so the core idea of this bill is that it places an onus on companies to prove that goods were not made with forced labor, rather than operating on the assumption, operating on that assumption and then occasionally catching companies out when they violate it. And there are similar tools coming online soon in the EU. In the past, I think we've lived in a world where the risks to the corporate sponsors were primarily reputational. And that's, that's still a real problem, especially when we have observed the Chinese government stir up boycott sentiment directed at particular companies if they're perceived to have taken a critical position on a human rights issue like forced labor. But it's encouraging that increasingly that there are legislative avenues for holding companies accountable regarding complicity in human rights violations. There are also now 3 or 4 legal cases that have been brought by different kinds of civil society groups, international justice organizations, organizations made up by leaders of the Uyghur diaspora community that are actually taking companies to court in places like the Netherlands and Germany for violation of existing laws in those countries regarding goods made with forced labor. And I think that's, those should have been the considerations in the IOC's mind in deciding who they were going to contract to afford their uniforms. But I think it's just another example of how beholden the IOC is to Chinese government pressure rather than, even a sense of basic human decency, let alone international law.
Thanks, Sophie. And I think this is a good moment to make clear what the distinctions are here. It is the Chinese government that is committing crimes against humanity against its own citizens and has set up this repressive environment for the Olympics. But the IOC as an organization, so all enterprises are covered by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, whether they adopt them or not. So, right, all global sports federations are covered entities as enterprises under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that means that they're required to do human rights due diligence, monitoring, because the human rights situation has changed, right? It changed markedly from 2015 when China was awarded the Olympics to today in 2022. You need to do remediation if you find out that there are abuses in your supply chain or that there are press freedom violations. You need to fix it. And then finally, you need to be transparent about what you did. And those are the standards that the IOC will be held to now, before, during, and after the Beijing Olympics. I want to make sure that we're covering all of the questions. I'm going to go to Sean Engel from The Guardian about Orwellian surveillance in China being scared for athletes. Could you elaborate? What is the worst that could happen if someone makes a podium protest in support of human rights, or perhaps has spoken out previously on a topic like freedom in Hong Kong or Tibet? I'm going to go to Yacho for this question. What could actually happen to athletes if someone makes a protest or speaks out?
Well, we don't know yet. However, look at the Peng Shuai case. She made one post on the Chinese social media alleging sexual assault against a retired high-level Chinese official. Look at what happened. She has been, her voice has been entirely wiped off the Chinese internet. Anybody who discusses her cases are, removed from the internet. And then the government even brought the IOC into creating a propaganda thing about, she's been doing well, she's not been harmed. So just look at this case, you can see what could happen to other athletes to speak up about, the case issues that the government deemed critical. And let's, keep in mind, Chinese people still can, to an extent, discussing sexual assault, gender equality issues. And the cases regarding Xinjiang, issues regarding Xinjiang, Hong Kong are considered much sensitive in the Chinese government's eyes. So this is the Peng Shuai case is a good indicator of what could possibly happen. And the Chinese laws are very, vague on the crimes they can use to prosecute people's free speech. You can be charged with picking quarrels and provoking trouble for speaking up. You can be charged for inciting subversion. So there are all kinds of crimes can be leveled for your peaceful, critical comments. And as Sophie mentioned earlier, China's conviction rate is 99%. All those, facts are a good indicator of what could happen to athletes if they decide to speak up.
Thanks very much. I want to come to a question from Grit Hartmann, a journalist from Germany who's covered these issues for many years. She writes, I agree that the responsibility of the IOC must be addressed first. Nevertheless, the question to the athletes' representatives, is there an obligation for athletes to be present at the opening ceremony? Would you advise them under the circumstances to forego the celebrations, which is obviously a display of China's acceptance in the world? This goes to the tough and completely unacceptable spot that athletes are put in, a box that they're put in where they have very few choices. I'm going to go first to Noah, who's participated in opening and closing ceremonies for past Olympics, and then to Craig and Rob. Noah, what avenues are available for athletes to protest based on your experience?
Yeah, so well, quickly about the opening closing, whether athletes have an obligation to go to opening closing ceremonies. I mean, they do not. Many athletes choose not to go in order to prioritize their sport performance. I attended the first half of the opening ceremonies in Sochi and then went home early because I was racing 2 days later. And in Pyeongchang, I skipped the opening ceremonies entirely because I was racing 2 days later. So it is, athletes always have the choice whether or not to attend the opening and closing ceremonies. To the heart of the question about whether the ceremonies or any other place is a place where athletes can speak up. But in the past, the biggest tool that I had as an athlete to speak up was through my own social media platforms and my own website. In Russia, for instance, I was blogging daily during the Olympics, kind of about life inside the games, and I was personally having a great experience because that's I understand now the image that the Russians hoped I would project, and I did. Very diligently. I talked about the amazing conditions in the village and the wonderful venue that we had to compete at, and then news outlets started picking that up, including Russia TV1, and they requested an interview, and I went up to the mix zone in the evening and gave an interview. Those were all opportunities for me to speak up. Now, whether those same opportunities exist in China, I think we all know, based on the conversation for the last hour and 10 minutes, that they're not that those spaces also come with risk. But in general, based on the IOC limitations, and the IOC has made some changes since Pyeongchang, where they've introduced an areas particularly for protest within the Olympic Village. But those are completely inadequate protections for athletes, as I said earlier, like the biggest platform for athletes comes when the most spotlight is on them, and that's on the field of play and on the podium, and at the opening and closing ceremonies, places where the IOC has expressly prohibited athletes from speaking up.
Thanks. I'm going to, we're reaching the end of our time here. I want to My colleague Sabera Azizi has put into the chat the contact details for interviews, for comments from our panel of experts. I'm going to go to a quick a round of closing comments, but I also wanted to answer the question of what can athletes do. Human Rights Watch, in our communications with the International Olympic Committee, has long advocated since well before the 2008 Beijing Olympics that the IOC adopt human rights and put in place a system of human rights bidding requirements, a system of human rights monitoring, and a system of human rights remedy that would address a lot of the problems that Maximilian Klein, Rob Kohler, Craig Foster, and others have identified. And that's certainly in our communications with sponsors. We have written to sponsors to request that they back human rights reforms. That means that human rights would go into the Olympic Charter, and it will be someone's job to monitor human rights abuses and to work to mitigate them, including against athletes. And that's certainly something that athletes could do that would have an important effect, is to advocate for human rights. I mentioned at the top of our discussion the athletes, the amazing Olympic Project for Human Rights that was created in 1968. It's 2022, and we still don't have an Olympic human rights system and framework, and leaving it until after the Beijing Olympics has been a recipe for disaster. I wanted to go for our last round of comments to Craig Foster first, who has stayed up well past 1:30 in the morning in Melbourne. Craig, some closing thoughts on these games, and after that we will leave it to everyone to contact our experts individually. Craig?
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be involved, and to all my fellow brilliant panelists. I would just say that, reiterate my opening comments, that I think 2022 is an incredibly important year in the history of global sport. You know, if you look at, for instance, in November later this year, in my sport, in football, there's around 170 goals scored in every FIFA World Cup. And each of those is a wonderful moment, brings, you know, tremendous amount of passion around the world. But there's somewhere around 38 migrant workers who will die for each of those goals. So when one of the finest players in the world scores an incredible goal and everyone cheers, there's 38 families and related members and communities who are in serious pain. That's not sport. When we go into the Olympic Games, and Noah and others can tell me how many gold medals there might be in Olympic Games, we have over 1 million people. We don't even know the full extent of what's going on in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs, because the UN rapporteurs have not been allowed in, despite the fact that the IOC is an independent observer of a political body. This is the organization that deems itself to be apolitical. When every gold medal is scored, there are literally thousands, tens of thousands of Uyghurs who are being egregiously abused. That is not sport. 2022 has the two largest sporting tournaments that the globe has ever created, and neither of them represent what sport purports to be. Every journalist in sport around the world needs to prosecute that. Athletes also need to step up this year and take their responsibility to hold their own organisations to account, both of those organisations, and we need to make change for 2023 and beyond.
Thanks very much, Craig. We're going to give you the last word. We encourage thank you to everyone who's joining today. For journalists who are traveling to China, we thank you for taking the risk you are taking to bring coverage of these issues. We strongly encourage you to consult Human Rights Watch's World Report on the chapter on China for the topics to cover. And we also want to thank you for the important work that you're doing. Without press freedom, their other human rights protections are very difficult to secure. I wanted to close out by saying that these Olympics in Beijing will be historic for all of the wrong reasons. And I hope that you'll circle back to our panelists and our experts for coverage in coming days and weeks, and also that even after these Olympics are over, that there will be a reckoning about, as Craig says, never again having a such a catastrophic human rights situation for athletes, journalists, and others. Thank you all for joining today, and good luck to all traveling to Beijing.